So good evening, everyone. Happy Inauguration Eve. I am Tulsa City Councilor Kara Joy McKee, not making a partisan statement there. Just know that many of you are holding your breath and ready to be able to focus on other things like exciting missing middle housing very soon, like myself. I am not going to stay for the whole meeting because, as you may be able to hear, I have a nasty sinus infection. Don't worry, I got my COVID test today. I really don't think that's what it is, but I get tested every other week. I wanted to let you all know I'm Owen Park and Crosbie Heights are some of my favorite neighborhoods. Those of you that I've worked with in the neighborhoods know that. And there's already actually some of this missing middle housing in your neighborhoods. There are also other opportunities. As you'll hear from the NCOG staff, we've got some non-conforming uses that we want to be able to protect with this potential overlay and some new opportunities we might like to create. So the intention tonight is to really start getting some more feedback from you all. And I want to emphasize start. This isn't a done deal. We are listening to you. The staff at NCOG thank you, Sarah. The staff at NCOG has been working on this. They've got a good presentation and it's interesting, and we really want your feedback. I'm looking over the attendees. I'm so glad that you all, as usual, are well engaged on this and on other issues. I also know that several of you have been at the other two meetings, and I know that y'all are concerned about the Pioneer Monument as well as the drainage issues in the pond. I want to reassure you that I am working on those things, that there will be more time to talk about that stuff soon. And especially if you are not in one of these neighborhoods, I just want to remind everyone that to please allow plenty of time and space for the neighbors of Owen Park and Crosbie Heights to voice their questions and concerns. I know that there are a lot of things we could discuss, but tonight we've got planning professionals who want to know what of these options matter to you and what you want for your neighborhoods. They're really good folks, and so are you. I'm glad that you get to talk to each other, and this meeting will be recorded so I can watch it later. Not only for me, but for everyone. They'll explain more details on how to see that meeting. Travis, Susan, Amy, have I forgotten anything?
No, that sounds great.
All right. I really appreciate you all for the team for the presentation tonight, and for all the neighbors turning out tonight to give input. And I will talk to you all again soon. Have a great meeting.
Thank you. Feel better.
Thanks. Will do.
Hi, I'll get us started. Susan Miller here. Someone's asking about attendees, and I was going to tell you that anyway. So it looks like right now, and this participants, Travis, want to give me does this include staff as well?
Yeah, there are 6 panelists and 15 attendees.
Okay, thank you. So that's who we have on the call right now. Our numbers may, fluctuate during the meeting for sure. And so first I'm going to introduce us and talk a little about the agenda. And so also this is just to kind of set it up too, because I will give some instructions on how we do the question and answer part. This is a little different format of a Zoom meeting. We had a crazy hacker a couple of weeks ago now at a meeting where all kinds of things went berserk. And so we're trying to get a little bit of more control over it. So I'll talk about that in a minute. So I'm Susan Miller. If you don't know me, I'm the director of the Tulsa Planning Office. Tonight we have several people on the call and that will be contributing to the discussion from the Planning Office. There's Travis Hulse, who is the principal planner for Planning and Design Group. You probably know Travis. He did work on he was the one that managed the contract for the housing study. So he's worked with a lot of people probably on this call. Nathan Foster, he's a senior planner in the planning office for current planning, and a lot of you that have been in our office for zoning or BOA applications and subdivision, you may know Nathan. He's been around a while and very knowledgeable, and a lot of people talk to him about their property and development issues. And then there's Amy Almer, who is the planner in the Planning and Design Group, who's helped us sort of set these meetings up and help us get through these things. So that's who's going to be on the call tonight from the Planning Office. And if you want to go ahead, I'll talk about the agenda. First, Travis will give a summary of the housing study and the results of a survey, a housing and community survey that we administered last fall. And then he's also going to talk about just some general adopted city policy on housing, especially as it relates to this area. So he'll point those documents and policies out that really pertain to Owen Park and Crosbie Heights. And so then I believe it's Nathan that's going to start talking about missing middle housing and what we mean by that. I just learned today, I guess, for sure, that it's an actually coined term that a consultant came up with in 2010 or something like that. And so I didn't really know that. It's something I've heard for so long. I didn't know it had much of an origin. So, and then we're going to talk about missing middle overlay and what that means, what that could look like for your neighborhood, and why that might be something that you want. And this is just the beginning of that discussion. Before we move forward with it for any particular neighborhood, we want to make sure it's what they want. And then we'll talk about next steps after that, and then we'll have the question or Q&A part of the presentation. So let me kind of talk about the format a little bit. We will go through the presentation, and this is a webinar format of a Zoom meeting. So unless we unmute you, you can unmute yourself. That was part of the tool in the webinar that allows us to control the hacking potential. So once we get to the question and answer, well, actually, even during the meeting, there's a Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. If you would focus any comments and questions into that section of the meeting, that would be preferred. And then when we get to that section of the agenda, we'll look at that and answer your questions as we go. We'll also just be checking it as we go along. And if there's something that we can answer as we're giving the presentation, we'll do that. And if you would, once we get to that part, and if you want to speak and for us to unmute you, if you could raise your hand, and there's a little hand icon, I guess, at the bottom of the screen that you can, like Tom just did it a minute ago, I guess. So you can just push on that and we'll see that you have a question, and we'll unmute you and we can talk with you then. Also, let's see what else we need to know. We talked about the participants. Right now we have 23, so a couple more people have joined us. And I guess the only other thing I will say is that, this meeting, we scheduled 2 hours. It's however long we need. We may not need 2 hours. I think one meeting lasted that we had with another neighborhood. I think another one lasted 2. And then somewhere all in between that. So however long we need, we just want to make sure everyone understands what we're talking about and has their questions answered and all of that. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Travis.
Thanks. Yeah, so Susan mentioned, I've interacted with many of you. Hopefully we have a few new people here, but in some recent efforts and initiatives, the city of Tulsa, one of the more recent efforts that this is really a part of and coming out of is the housing study that was completed. We're going to get into that here in a minute. But Crosbie Heights specifically had a small area plan that wasn't just a few years ago, working through that with many on the Citizens Advisory Team, the comprehensive plan back in 2010, and then we've had a couple of surveys, one a part of the housing study, and then one that we recently did, Susan mentioned. So we wanted to ask just a quick poll question to kind of see if we have any new faces or if everybody's been participating and following along in a lot of these. So Amy is going to go ahead and launch a poll. If you wouldn't mind responding to that and letting us know which of the following you have participated in specifically. We'll give you a couple minutes if you wouldn't mind filling that out. And once we get a participation, we will share the results on that so everyone can kind of see what we've got. And this will be really helpful, especially as we talk about each of these a little bit tonight. Give us a good sense of maybe where we need to talk a little bit more or spend a little bit of time giving some background. Or again, if a lot of these are very familiar to you already, then we kind of know where to spend the most of our time for tonight and the information that we present. There's a lot of information. Somebody asked if we'd be sharing that, and we will, much more than we could possibly spend tonight, and probably too much to get through. So we'll be sharing a lot of those details afterwards, and certainly have more opportunities to talk and make ourselves available. Okay, so it looks like we have a good mix. Some, maybe less than half, participated in the small area plan, which is good to know. The housing study survey specifically, a little bit more. And then again, somewhere around half for the survey and the comprehensive plan back in 2010. So as we go through this presentation, we have 25 slides about. If you have questions, comments, any things that you maybe want to know a little bit more about that we skip over or don't quite get into, feel free to throw those questions and comments into the Q&A box, and we'll see those at the end and kind of take those one by one, and Nathan and I will address those and other members of the panel. So don't be shy. If you don't know or aren't familiar, go ahead and throw that out there. So I'm going to start by spending a little bit of time first with the housing study. So the housing study that was most recently completed, the early part of 2020, was an update to a study done back in 2010. That study really focused its implementation efforts on the downtown area within the IDL. And in 2020, we hired a consultant out of St. Louis to really look at the market demand for housing within this expanded boundary. Much of the priorities coming out of the city of Tulsa from Mayor Bynum and the housing policy director is really about looking at these neighborhoods outside of downtown, understanding that they are a health and a vital asset to the city as a whole. So the study includes a lot of those neighborhoods. Obviously, tonight we are talking to you all in the Crosbie Heights, Owen Park area. There's a lot of other neighborhoods that were also included in that effort. So you are number 4 of 5 neighborhoods that we're talking with. Our last one this coming Thursday is with Greenwood Unity Heritage, which includes a lot of neighborhoods, Dunbar, Joe Louis, Legacy, the Heights, so on and so forth. That study, as it looked at the market demand for housing, was really all about what do we see potential wise within this area over the next 10 years. And we wanted to answer a lot of these questions about if there's a market gap in housing, how do we address that? And what does the demand look like at all different income levels? Realizing that there may be a greater need at different income levels, and we want to understand that because that influences the type of approach we take to implementation as a city. We also wanted to know what types of support or even concerns that there might be from both the development community as well as residents, property owners. So it's good to see that many of you participated in that. For those of you that didn't, this is another opportunity that we're making available to get some feedback and build into our overall understanding of housing within your neighborhood specifically. So the housing study covers a lot. It's about, I want to say, a couple hundred pages long, and something that gets into the weeds of feasibility and a lot of other things. On the next slide, I'll actually show you one of the highlights kind of from that study is this 10-year market demand that does break down by income levels, like I mentioned. So for the next 10 years, the housing study and the consultants really looked at things like employment growth. They looked at the various income levels, feasibility from a land cost perspective, construction cost perspective, and came up with what was their projected demand into the next 10 years. As you can tell, that demand spreads across all of these income levels. It's concentrated more in the affordable, workforce, moderate income brackets. And those income levels are listed there on this slide. $34,000 or less was identified as affordable. Workforce, $34,000 to $67,000 a year. So you kind of get a sense of what that's really telling you, or what that told us, all the way up to luxury. So this is kind of the start of the conversation, recognizing the gaps, wanting to know, okay, so what do we do about addressing those gaps? We deployed a survey to all of the city of Tulsa. And in fact, even people outside of the city participated. We had over 2,000 participants. And a lot of the questions that were asked in that survey started to get at, okay, if we're going to address those different housing demand at various income levels, what are the various housing types that we might consider? And this is especially an important question for you all as people who live in these neighborhoods. You know, what would you be supportive of? What would you be interested in? So the survey asked a question actually showing these same pictures, wanting to know what you would be comfortable with in building, or historic loft apartments, triplexes, townhomes, detached homes, all sorts of different things. Crosbie Heights and Owen Park, I think we have a few different examples of some of these, but the diversity is maybe not as much as what we've seen in the past historically. What was allowed in some of these neighborhoods around the time of the mid-century, detached homes really became the priority. So we want to kind of know how people are feeling now in 2020. This is a breakdown of that question, and this is citywide. So if a building were located within downtown or a surrounding neighborhood, which would you be interested in? And this was the response that we heard. So everybody, including a few outside of Tulsa, over 50% told us they would be interested in either apartments, detached homes, duplex, triplex, quadplex, townhomes, and then maybe not so much support for things like micro units, high-rise apartment complexes. So that helps us understand really what we need to be focused on as we're thinking about housing options within the neighborhood. To break those results down a little bit more, this looks at the responses within really the neighborhood itself. And these vary. They're a little bit different than what we saw citywide. So in that shaded yellow portion, let's see, we had about 70 people participate in that survey in this yellow portion that's shaded here. And this is what we heard. So in this case, maybe a few other options fell below 50%. Some of the apartment options, in addition to high-rise apartments and micro units, found their way to kind of the bottom of the list, if you will. But there was still, I think, broad support for a diversity of other options. So detached homes was very popular. But again, we also saw interest in townhomes, again, those duplex, triplex, quadplex. So we want to talk a little bit with you more about that tonight. And we're actually going to have an opportunity for you to give us some input on this specific question again, knowing that we might have some folks who didn't get a chance to participate in that survey. So the housing study mentioned one specific action that, based upon all of the research of the market, talking to developers, the deployment of the survey itself, that we really needed to start addressing and looking into. That action for our office, the Tulsa Planning Office, was to look at potential barriers to what is called missing middle infill development. And I'll define that here in a second, but it's generally those types of homes we were asking about. So looking at the zoning code, understanding what regulations might currently be prohibiting types of homes or making it challenging for the development of different homes. that people would really like to see. And what we heard from the survey is that there is an interest in some of these other options. So we've spent the past number of months starting to look into that, and we'll share with you some of our proposed solutions and what we believe could open the door and provide an opportunity for other housing types within your neighborhood. So missing middle, it's a term you'll hear often, especially from us. Nationwide is very common. The folks at Opticos Design are credited with this image, and you can learn more at their website, their missingmiddlehousing.com. But missing middle is really all about those homes that fall in between a detached single family home and then all the way up to kind of your mid-rise or your larger scale apartment. They're called missing and middle because missing suggests, again, at the turn of the century, really started to focus on detached homes. So you just didn't see these housing types built nearly as much. You still did, but maybe just not as prevalent. And then middle because size-wise, they fit in between those two kind of ends of the spectrum. So I wanted to pull in some other survey questions just to kind of show you what we have been hearing as we've been asking these questions. One of those is about the potential benefits of bringing new housing into existing neighborhoods. And that's really what we're talking about. So this was a separate survey from the housing study. This one was done more recently. Hopefully many of you were able to participate in this. Just kind of asking the question of, if we were to really promote the policy of new housing in existing neighborhoods, what would you see as the most beneficial aspect of that? We also asked about concerns. Tonight, I'm going to focus on the benefits more than the concerns, although we'll make all of those results available to you. So over, I think 90% or 90% agreed that number one, this was a benefit in the perspective that it would help replace or rehabilitate older, poorly maintained homes. We see that pretty common throughout many of the neighborhoods surrounding downtown, especially where you have an older housing stock and for whatever reason have not been maintained over time. And so that could be a potential benefit of offering, new housing, new options within neighborhoods. Another was more efficient use of existing city infrastructure. So when you build out your core, the middle of the city, you're really using what's already available, not having to stretch out water, sewer, roads further into the periphery of the city, into the suburbs. And so that can be a more efficient use of what's already available and lessens the burden on our system having to continue to update and maintain those new assets as well. And then the third one was farmland and green space outside of the city can be preserved. So this kind of just, I think is insightful to some of the benefits and things that we understood to be maybe the focus of why missing middle is important. This shows you kind of a breakdown of how those responses came in from the specific areas kind of surrounding downtown. It's kind of hard to see there, but in the middle of your screen, just right below the word Tulsa is the IDL. So you all are kind of just to the west of that. And all kind of the light blue, dark blue said that for those top three things that I just mentioned, people were either somewhat interested or very interested in those benefits. So we use this information. We'll continue to take the survey results as we develop our initiatives and different ways to implement the actions and the priorities developed in the housing study. This relates in a lot of ways to things that we've already heard. So I'll just mention a couple of those real quick. The first one is this Crosbie Heights Small Area Plan back in 2019 when that was going on, and a lot of that time was spent talking about these things with you all. There were goals in there that included these same concepts. So promoting the development of complete neighborhoods, which specifically called out a mix of smaller residential structures including many of the types that I've already mentioned. Another goal was thought to really help promote and revitalize Crosbie Heights specifically. And that could be done by encouraging and allowing compatible infill. So these are things that we've heard before from you all, and I think are reinforced, reiterated through the surveys that we've done, the conversations that we've had. The last one was the comprehensive plan. And I'll just briefly say that there were a couple of goals mentioned in the comprehensive plan that citywide really support this. So I think you get the point, but this is important for us in the work that we do so that we understand that in developing what we will start talking about next is an overlay tool that we feel like could really address some of these things that we've been hearing. So Nathan's going to talk more about that, what the overlay is, how it really attempts to address many of the preferences and the input that we've received through these efforts. So I'm going to turn it over to him, and again, throw your comments and questions in that Q&A box, and we'll get to those here in a minute.
Great. Thanks, Travis. Well, first I kind of want to just define the overlay and kind of let people know what that tool is so that you better understand what it is that we're talking about when we're discussing the possibility of trying to attempt one of these or initiating any sort of process. The overlay tool was established in our update to the zoning code back in 2015, and it allowed us to essentially go in and define geographies where we'd like to tailor zoning restrictions to meet certain intents or to try and accomplish recommendations that have been established through either small area planning efforts or things like the housing study, where we're getting recommendations and feedback from neighborhoods about what might be more appropriate. The good thing about the overlay is that we don't have to change everything citywide in order to take this tool and use it as a way to start opening up what we believe are missing opportunities or inconsistencies in what the zoning allows currently and what we understand to be the desire for that neighborhood. The overlay is something that essentially allows you to either loosen or tighten the underlying zoning restrictions and open up new uses that may be now available, or change setbacks or lot size requirements that previously may have stood in the way of some of these missing middle concepts that we're talking about. So with that tool in mind, what we tried to do was initially go back and just do an audit of our zoning code and the current restrictions that exist with the zonings that exist in these neighborhoods. Primarily, a lot of the Crosbie Heights area is zoned an RM, or a multifamily residential district, while a lot more of the Owen Park area is zoned single family residential. Typically in the single family districts, most of, or none of these uses necessarily are allowed except for the detached home that can be built on a single lot and have one unit on that lot. So in the multifamily districts, there are some more options, but really what may impact those lots more is the current regulations on how large a lot has to be to support some of these additional housing types, or how wide it has to be. So that's kind of getting into lot area and lot width requirements, as well as nonconformities. A lot of the lots that were platted in these neighborhoods were platted long before the zoning code of today was written, or even the zoning code of 1970 and before that came into effect and kind of started to draw us back on some of these types of uses and change the way that they could be approved. So you might imagine that in the 70s, when initially zoning was beginning to be adopted for the city of Tulsa, there was kind of a desire to spread out single family neighborhoods and make sure that more density was on more land so that there wasn't an impact on those neighborhoods. And I think what we're learning as we move forward is obviously we're trying to get back to something that did exist in maybe the 20s and the 30s in some of these neighborhoods and may still be there. But instead of continuing to restrict those or prevent those from being utilized or updated, what we want to try to do is make sure that the code is accommodating some of that work and also opening up new opportunities for this type of housing in the neighborhoods so that people can do that without additional steps. At the moment, any type of housing that's not a single family home in a single family district would require either significant relief from the Board of Adjustment or a full rezoning through the Planning Commission and the City Council. In the multifamily districts, the variances and the Board of Adjustment stuff is probably more likely due to the multifamily lots. But hopefully we can remove some of those extra steps and make it a more by right way of developing in these neighborhoods, if we learn from the neighborhoods that that's something that's appropriate. So what I'm going to do is cover what we identified first, which was just purely use restrictions. And I want to cover each of the different uses as they're described in our zoning code, as we're talking about the potential of changing how they're allowed currently. So townhomes are currently restricted to our very high density single family neighborhoods, like a 4 or an RS5, which is very rare if even existing in these neighborhoods. And a townhouse is really just a single unit, but on a smaller lot, and it's a series of units that share common walls and a common lot line that allows you to put more units in the space where typically maybe only one single family home would have been built. So a lot of times this can lead to more affordability. It also helps kind of blend with a neighborhood character if there's existing single family homes around. And today we just don't have those opportunities in these neighborhoods. And so the first step would be trying to find a way to make sure that this is a permitted use that someone could build theoretically in this neighborhood. The next one would be a duplex, which I'm sure most of you really understand what a duplex is. It's a 2-unit on one lot building. And currently, that's something that can only be achieved in single family districts with a special exception. In some of the multifamily districts, it's allowed, but it requires a larger lot size, sometimes like a 9,000 square foot lot, which is not typically seen in these neighborhoods. So the duplex is, again, just a way to add additional units to a single lot without ultimately just departing from maybe whatever character is already there in the neighborhood. There's a picture there on the screen of something at 19th and Cincinnati that can even be a stacked duplex where there's 2 units, one on top of the other instead of side by side, as you might typically see, which just allows for some creativity when talking about how we might establish these uses. Daniel Jeffries in our office worked to put together a few renderings where he took some existing duplexes in town and placed them within some existing neighborhoods, so you could see how that character matches what is really just 2 single family homes to either side with a duplex in the middle where you have 2 units, and maybe they're smaller, there's common maintenance areas, it leads to it being a little more affordable, or even the potential for someone to own one side, own the unit and rent out one side for an income property. So this is just a few more examples of that specific circumstance kind of being shown. Another use that our zoning code established was the idea of a cottage house development. And there's not a lot of examples of this in town as it stands today, and likely due to the fact that I think we've been heavily restricted on anything like this for a while due to our zoning regulations. But the cottage house development really envisions more of a village type orientation where several detached units, whether they're smaller homes or even larger, there's no real control, can be placed around a common open space and oriented toward like a green space and shared space versus the street, how you would typically see a neighborhood platted out. This really opens up opportunities to try and create or insert, I guess, more units into previous spaces that would have been restricted to being lotted out or subdivided with streets. So multi-unit houses are very similar to duplexes, but they've increased how many units would be allowed. And there's also some additional design controls within the zoning code on how multi-unit houses can be established. So a multi-unit house is really just 3 to 4 units in a common building with a single entrance. So this means that all of those units are going to enter off of either a hallway or a stairwell to make it look more like a single family home or a detached house in a neighborhood. This is a really good way to insert density within single family neighborhoods while maintaining that similar character to homes that you would already see. So there's even some examples in the picture here that exist near, I think in the Swan Lake neighborhood, so 17th and Quincy, of a couple of 4-unit multi-unit houses within that neighborhood. The final use we've talked through is the classification of apartments or condominium projects. So our code controls apartment complex density with lot areas and basically states, if you have this much land, then you can do this many units as long as you can address the parking and the things that come with it. So as we started to talk about apartments, we knew that obviously just opening the floodgates to, a lot of apartments didn't seem to be the main demand or even I guess, what would be appropriate based on the feedback we'd received in both the survey and some of the small area plan work that had been done. So the idea of trying to both allow apartments in some areas, but control that unit count and make sure that those buildings don't become something that's out of character or out of scale with what's nearby, would basically look like allowing that use type, but putting those additional controls. And for the overlay purposes, we kind of thought 12 units would match what some of the recommendations were. But later we're going to ask you guys a question to try and gain some more feedback on what you all think is really appropriate. So this is another set of SketchUp examples of what would be really considered apartments in the city of Tulsa. And this one is a triplex, so it's got 3 units. They each have their own entry from a different side of the structure. And that would be classified as an apartment within the zoning code. So trying to allow something of that scale seems to be what is in demand in these neighborhoods. This is a 4plex, or a 6plex, I'm sorry, and it's another example right here in town. I think it's also in the Swan Lake neighborhood at 16th and Quaker Avenue. So this is showing how 6 units obviously could be just fit in right between two-story single-family homes, and really fit into that neighborhood scale, what's already existing. So the final poll that we were going to ask is really regards to that use discussion. And after hearing those descriptions of each of those uses or those definitions, what are those concerns that you have, but also which ones of these do you think you would support being constructed in your neighborhood? We took the apartment category and we tiered it out into a separate set of units so that we could really try and gauge apartments at different scales, not just apartments as one holistic use. So that gives you an option to kind of choose between 6, 8, 10, and 12. I think that pulls up on the screen now. So we'll give you guys a chance to answer that, and then Amy will share the results with us, and we can kind of begin to discuss a little more before we move into the next steps and then the Q&A. So it looks like we ended up with 15 responses. It looks like there's a good mix of support in the neighborhood for some of these different uses. It does look like a lot of the concentration kind of focused on the cottage house idea, triplex, quadplex, and duplexes, as well as multi-unit houses kind of had the most support. Kind of the apartments looks like 8 units seem to be the max out really for the most support coming from folks. Over up to 6 units, I guess, is where over half of people were saying they were in support of that. So this is helpful as we kind of, it looks like really the 6 units is maybe what people find to be most appropriate when we're talking about apartments. And I think that's been fairly common in some of the polls that we've asked. But yeah, this is a good response to that poll, and will definitely help us as we start talking through the idea of an overlay and what that might look like for this geography. So I think on the next slide, I take you through some of the steps that this overlay process would go through and how that might impact you or what we can do to make sure you guys are still engaged. So when an overlay is proposed in the city of Tulsa, it goes through a 2-step process, really. The first is going through a text amendment, which means we have to actually take whatever the proposed regulations are, and we have to adopt those into our zoning code. And then just like any other zoning district, that second step is actually going out and amending the zoning map to apply that set of regulations to a specific geography. So we put some months on here and some tentative dates just to kind of let you guys understand how fast this moves, or maybe the vice versa. But typically what would happen is the text amendments would be taken through the Planning Commission first, and then they go on to the City Council for a final adoption. Planning Commission typically has a work session first to just discuss with staff what's being proposed and have an opportunity to ask questions if they still have any confusion about it, prior to actually having the public hearing where folks can come in, they can make comments, they can support or object to what's being proposed. And the Planning Commission can make changes or send it back to staff to continue to adapt based on what they hear. If they ultimately approve of what's happening, then they make that recommendation to the City Council, who gets to make the final decision. Those map amendments on the backside would really follow a very similar process. The one exception there would be that there is a lot more public engagement when it comes to the map amendment, because that's when we're actually talking about specific properties that would be impacted. So when any map amendment is proposed, we would notify both the owners within that overlay, but also even property owners within 300 feet before there were any actual meetings that took place on making decisions about it. Once it actually gets past the public engagement step and into the process, it follows that work session, TMAPC hearing, and then city council hearing process, just like the text amendments did before it would be adopted and effective in any neighborhoods. Typically, when we've adopted overlays in the past, we do have several in town, like the River Design Corridor. We also have an overlay in place on Route 66. When those were done, even before we started the process of actually notifying with required notices, we had set up several public meetings, just like we're doing now, to continue discussing with the neighborhoods specifically what we were talking about, just to avoid there being any feeling of rush or this outstanding questions that couldn't get answered before we got through into an actual formal hearing. So you guys could definitely, I would say, be comfortable knowing that we'll notify everyone well in advance before anything like this were ever to move through any process, so we could continue having this discussion and talking about what's being proposed. And at that point in time, obviously, drafts of the amendments and things would be made available for everyone to review and discuss. We've also provided a few links here. And like Travis said, we'll share this presentation with you all, so you'll have all of this. But this just gets you connected to our office and kind of keeps you in with what's going on with us, so that you can still be engaged and remain engaged throughout the process as we continue to talk about progress on these things. So with that, we really want to start moving into the Q&A, and we have some prompts on the screen for discussion if you guys want to respond to some of those in the chat and just give us some feedback. But if you have specific questions for us, please use that Q&A function and submit those. And what we'll do is just kind of start working through those. And I think as we answer them, we'll share them so everyone can see what the question is. And then as we talk, if you guys decide you'd like to discuss something or you have more comments, use that raise your hand feature and we can call on you to have that discussion, and Amy can help us get you unmuted so you can actually talk with us. So with that, I think, Travis, we can just start pulling up the questions and begin talking through what people have sent in.
Sounds good. Yeah, there's a couple of questions in the chat, so we'll try and kind of try not to miss anyone. The first one that I'm seeing, just kind of going in order here in the Q&A. So Rachel has a great question here. Let me make this, hopefully people can see that, asking about the considering the anticipated long-term impact of COVID-19 on local housing needs as related to income changes. So that's a great question, great point. So I'll just say that a lot of the housing study was completed pre-COVID. And so as you can imagine, some of the market dynamics that were present at that given time are much different now. However, we still had our consultants available to us, accessible for really asking that question. So the housing study provides some good guidance to the city regarding this specifically about COVID. And I won't go into all of it. There's kind of a lot of different things there to unpack, a lot of uncertainty, even still not knowing what those long-term effects will look like. Just generally in the Tulsa real estate market, because of low interest rates, you're seeing the housing market just explode. So there's some interesting things going on right now. But they do talk about in the study with a number of priorities and actions that are identified because of COVID and that impact, that really it kind of focuses on the set of actions that will address things like those folks who are facing unemployment or reduced hours at work, who may no longer have savings or assets that they are working to build in order to get into home ownership. So they would recommend focusing efforts on home ownership supports, things like down payment assistance, credit repair, flexible loan terms, financial counseling, lots of other things. So it really does shift the way that some of the recommendations need to be prioritized and focused on first. And I think that what we see in this missing middle conversation about different housing options is missing middle. We didn't talk about this a whole lot in the presentation, but it does address kind of that the income gap, if you will, and just level of affordability. If you only have detached homes available in a neighborhood, you're pretty limited to the types of folks who may be able to either rent or own in that specific setting. So opening options by way of duplexes, multi-unit homes, what we kind of heard from this group, apartments up to 6 units, can really help to address some of those concerns. So great question.
Travis, I can address some of this one. James has asked, what can be done to create intentional communities with communal kitchens, gardens, and workshops? To that point, I'll mention that along with the zoning code update that I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we did strive to do was make sure that community gardens were a permissible use in all residential districts. That's something that was previously not authorized through our city zoning code, and often would create issues when somebody was trying to establish a community garden or something on a common lot in their neighborhood. So that first step is really a removal of a barrier that would have previously prevented a neighborhood from organizing and determining, hey, this is a vacant lot in our neighborhood, we'd like to use that for like a communal garden space. Some of the additional uses you mentioned, like the kitchens and workshops, it really depends on the scale of that use, how that would be looked at. But it's interesting, and it's a very good point. And I think it definitely correlates with what we're talking about with missing middle and trying to build these better communities. So if there's specific types of uses you're talking about, or things you could share with us, I'd be happy to look at those, and we could talk more about how that might be looked at under the current zoning code and what might have to change in order to accomplish something like that.
Some good comments on kind of the question of, do you already have missing middle housing types in your neighborhood? So I'll just mention these for those of you who haven't kind of noticed. Looks like there was, let's see, it's jumping around on me. Yeah, duplexes and fourplexes used to be common in Crosbie Heights. Many have been torn down. I think that's, something that goes back to just kind of the pattern and trends and history of housing. Good example of cottage behind the Unity Church over off Jamestown. Not familiar with that specifically, but we'll have to go take a look. Some of the others may be interested in that. Yeah, it'd be good to hear of other things that you see in your current everyday life, where you live, of things that you think work well. As we're developing this overlay, there's lots of things that we try to be aware of and thinking about, and what might impact a neighborhood and how to best address those. The overlay can't do everything. It's really just kind of one part of the tool. There's some other things as well, but yeah, if you have other examples of things that you've seen, either good or bad like that, that'd be great for us to know, so we can kind of see what's going on there.
So to Matthew's question in the Q&A, can you go into more detail about how density will be calculated? Our zoning code uses a formula based on lot area per unit. That's the typical format in most of our residential districts that determines how much density can fit on a specific lot. So I think for like RM2, for example, which is what's present in a lot of Crosbie Heights, you could do, it's like 1,100 square feet of lot area per unit. So that equates to probably about 6 units on your typical 50-foot by 140-foot lot that you might find in a previously platted neighborhood like this. But some of those other things may come into play, like a lot of times parking for 6 units doesn't fit once you make those calculations. And so there's a lot of things that control density that maybe aren't specifically tied to the density of a development that we're trying to address as well. And it's trying to balance each of those provisions to ensure that what we allow on the lot can be supported with its accessory stuff, but also make sure we're providing the necessary use that the housing study and everything is asked for. James, you have a question here about what can be done with allowing commercial uses in residential zones, or maybe putting bottom level commercial and top story residential, like the Boydell could have been useful for, but didn't. So the overlay does have that same flexibility for commercial uses. If there were very specific commercial uses that wanted to be approved or permitted in a very specific way, it could be done through an overlay. At the moment, there's really not any allowance in just a single family neighborhood for any type of commercial use, but the multifamily residential districts would allow some smaller scale offices and types of uses inside of a building if it were approved through like a special exception. So it's all about changing to the appropriate zoning if it weren't something that was going to be included in like an overlay. And at the moment, I don't know that we've heard enough support for trying to bring commercial units or commercial uses into those boundaries. But it's certainly something that could be discussed. And if there are existing structures that could be utilized that way, I know in the past we've definitely helped folks navigate a zoning process that got them to where that was usable again. And it made it something that could be an asset to the neighborhood. Fletcher, that's a really good question. Since Crosbie Heights is already zoned multifamily, what would the biggest change for the overlay be? So as I mentioned earlier, you could already do an apartment building on a Crosbie Heights RM2 neighborhood lot. However, some of the challenges we've seen are some of the lots don't even meet the 50-foot wide requirement, or they are smaller. They don't have enough lot area to provide enough units. And so it becomes infeasible for the apartment projects to be developed. The other thing really is parking. We've talked about the idea of trying to reduce parking requirements so that those parking requirements aren't pushing so much of the lot out of use for a potential multifamily structure. So those are some of the barriers that would change if we were to approach it in the Crosbie Heights neighborhood, would be addressing those non-conforming old lots and really the parking potential to be a barrier.
For this next question, Amy, can you go back to that slide that shows that 10-year demand chart? In short, yes. And on this chart, you'll kind of see there in the lighter blue sections of that demand is actually rental demand. The darker blue sections are for sale. So yeah, the housing study definitely contemplates the need for affordable rental housing, both developing new housing as well as renovating existing housing stock. And there's a number of different options for that. One of the things that the housing study does, really for, again, focusing on the market side of things, is it kind of breaks down what the gap for a development project looks like, whether it's a multifamily rehab or a single family rehab, taking into consideration things like land costs and soft costs, and all of those recommendations are contained within the housing study. So I'd encourage everyone to kind of take a look at that. Again, it's hard to share all of that information here, but a lot of those details are covered within the housing study. And I think a number of different options are available for what recommendations exist and what we can do, because there's a number of things that we're really being encouraged to look at. And rental is as much a part of that as ownership is for housing within these areas. And I apologize, I don't think I clicked on the answer live. So here's that question that I was responding to, but just asking if there were recommendations to develop or renovate existing housing stock as affordable rental. So in short, yes.
Tom's got a good comment and question here. It's discussing the Swan Lake neighborhood and how the mixture of apartments, townhomes, as well as detached houses and even large houses work in a way because of the way they're kind of all mixed in together and there's no concentration. Several sixplexes together would have the same effect of a large apartment complex and reduce the appeal of the area to some single family housing owners. That's a really good comment. And as we've talked about this in regards to the use and the way the lots work, we haven't really discussed any kind of dispersal standard for any of the uses discussed, but it isn't something that's foreign to the zoning code. It is something we've used in the past, and and it does exist. So that's a really good consideration, I think, that we should probably talk about and consider, because I think the comment's correct that you get a real large concentration of the units, and maybe it doesn't appeal the way everyone thought it might. So
Nathan, I don't know if you have an answer to this. The question about limitation to multi-unit, being that if a cost of a sprinkler system, a fire suppression system is required, then that would be coming from the building code, the fire code. Could very well be. I'll just say, I think, made sure to have these conversations about any policy decisions and directions for an overlay, but opening the doors for missing middle housing with our permit center and other folks within the city of Tulsa, our streets and stormwater transportation groups, trying to understand some of those issues. I don't know that that's one that has come up specifically. I'm trying to remember in the conversations that we've had. So I don't know of any specific help or support with that question necessarily. I do think that generally there are recommendations outlined in the housing study that, kind of regardless of the challenges and barriers to development of these homes, that we need to be looking for ways to provide subsidies or fill the gap of the overall cost. So a couple of those things are underway outside of the overlay for the housing study boundary area that we're talking about tonight, but I'll just mention a couple of them. One is specific to downtown, so it doesn't really touch upon the neighborhood that we're talking about tonight, but that is the redeployment of revolving loan funds through the Mayor's Office of Economic Development. And that was largely the implementation tool for the 2010 study that's led to many of the wonderful renovations and new builds downtown that you see. Another thing that's kind of very exciting, new to the city, I think for the first time in the history of the city, is the creation of an affordable housing trust fund. That's something being administered through the housing policy director, or in that role of the housing. It's not an office because there's one person, but a new position created in the mayor's office. So that affordable housing trust fund is primarily looking to address many of the challenges, and FEMI could be one of those things. I'm not entirely sure, but we could get you in touch with Kristen Mon is her name, to ask that question and see if that's something that falls within that category, or if MOED, the Mayor's Office of Economic Development, knows of anything as well. So we can get you the contacts there if you don't have them.
To Rachel's question regarding Phoenix, single family homes were rezoned to commercial housing, art galleries, and coffee shops without changing much regarding the faces of the houses. Are these kinds of commercial enterprises something that can be introduced through this overlay? Yes, the kind of going back to the question about how to introduce commercial uses. So our code currently, if you propose a use in the city of Tulsa, it has to be classified in one of the use categories that exist in the code. And so the way the overlay could work would be, piecemealing specific ones that maybe were thought to be more appropriate or could fit within a neighborhood character, and potentially allowing those. But as I mentioned earlier, we hadn't really talked much about the commercial or mixed use aspect in this conversation, as much as purely just the housing piece and trying to get some of these housing types allowed that are currently restricted. So certainly something that the neighborhood, if there is interest, could communicate with us, and we could definitely look at as a possibility with an overlay. Matthew, you have another question. As a follow-up to density, what design effects can be put in place to prevent cheap development that detracts from the character of the neighborhood? So just like anything, the zoning ordinance can set standards for design. It can be, as strict as detail about the actual structure, but also as loose as just different height restrictions or setbacks that may help accommodate or make sure that the development is in context or character with the surrounding development. But The overlay tool is pretty versatile in that way, and the way it can control design and things like that. It's just a matter of making sure we find a balance between what's going to be prohibitive or prevent someone from doing this versus while also making sure what we're allowing is going to be appropriate. Larry, your question here is regarding tiny homes. Interested in building tiny houses in Crosbie Heights on a double lot. These would be substantial, built to interested in subdividing a double lot for perhaps 3 to 4 tiny houses, sold as owner occupied. So that would really, if it's all going to remain on one lot as a rental, then it's going to be a cottage house development. If they're going to be detached homes that you'd like on their own lot, that someone buys the lot and the home, that's going to require a bit more investment due to the fact that it's going to become a subdivision that has to be served by mains for all infrastructure and by streets. So in addition to that, your lots have to meet those standard requirements that are in the zoning code already. The allowance of cottage house developments may address the question about starting to allow something like that, where you have 4, tiny homes around a common courtyard. But as it stands today, that's kind of the option. It's either going to be a cottage house development or it's going to have to be just a single family subdivision, and make sure that all those lots are going to conform to the requirements. I think we've addressed a few of the questions that had gotten left in chat earlier. And
yeah, I saw a comment just about, having a concern for larger units, and that is being parking. The example is given that parking was restricted to one side of the street. And I think we've seen that's, parking is one of the things we touched upon a little bit today, as being a part of an overlay. And we've talked a lot about, because we've seen both good examples of that and bad examples, unfortunately, in neighborhoods where that has created more problems than benefits. But so yeah, the concern is, I think, something that we're aware of, and when I mentioned talking with our streets and stormwater and traffic group, that's what we talked a lot about, where it may make sense to try and address on-street parking, making that an option to comply with some of the zoning code. We talked about that around, maybe the bus rapid transit system along Peoria and, soon to be Route 66 in the next few years. So maybe where you do have a more walkable, connected environment like that to some public transportation, and people aren't relying on automobile use as much. Would be curious to hear more if that is an interest, an interest as a benefit or a concern from this neighborhood specifically, but did want to call out that was one of the comments that was made, I think, in the chat somewhere. Otherwise, I think we've pretty much addressed the questions we have. We're not in any rush to get out of here necessarily, so we'll kind of wait to see if we have any other questions pop in there. I think Nathan mentioned our next steps. Councilor McKee mentioned early at the beginning of our meeting that this is really somewhere, I think she said the beginning, but really we're probably somewhere in the middle, because we've been working and developing what would be a proposed overlay for kind of that broader geography of the housing study boundary. That boundary itself is open to kind of flexibility a little bit. So what we've kind of defined as the Crosbie Heights neighborhood and the Owen Park neighborhood, there's been questions in some of our other neighborhood conversations about expanding that a little bit, or even contracting, I suppose, and focusing in certain areas. So that is something that we will continue to work towards and share out and let you know as we move through that process of the Planning Commission and City Council.
I think Amy's got our contact slide up now on the screen, so.
Sorry, everyone, for going through that very fast.
Some
That was
whiplash there.
Sorry, but I wanted to get to this, the last slide, so contact any of us, absolutely. And again, sorry about that.
I know we threw a lot of information out there today, so as you're thinking about it, or if things come up, please feel free to reach out and ask us questions. Give us a call. We're always open to setting up another Zoom call if you want to just talk offline about specific projects. So please feel free to use this as a resource. And like we said earlier, we'll obviously be back in touch as things progress and as we continue looking at these recommendations.
We've stalled long enough, Nathan, that we've got a few more questions coming in.
Okay.
So as far as other concerns coming up in the other neighborhoods, so we've talked with so far, let's see, we've talked with the Crutchfield neighborhood area, Pearl District neighborhood, Riverview and Cherry Street. And then I think that's it. And then you guys, Crosbie Heights and Owen Park. Thus far, I would say what we've heard from each of those neighborhoods is pretty similar to what we're hearing tonight. In the Pearl District, there was a pretty vocal concern about floodplain, being that there is floodplain identified within much of that neighborhood, along 6th Street especially. I can't recall, and I could pull up a map here, see if there's some floodplain in the Crosbie Heights neighborhood, but generally speaking, that concern was just about, I think I saw a question here as well. If we do begin to add density and fill in some of those areas that are currently vacant, what adverse impact could that potentially have from a stormwater management perspective, flooding perspective? And I hate to say this, but it really just depends. In many of these neighborhoods, as was made mentioned earlier in a comment on the chat, we had more density at one point in time than what we have today. And so the thought or the theory would be that we have the infrastructure in place, or the site and neighborhood is graded to drain in a certain way to really manage that stormwater. So what right now might be a vacant lot wasn't once upon a time, and there was a house there. And so some instances like that, you wouldn't see as much concern for flooding or adverse impact because there used to be a home there. And so in theory, again, not knowing the specifics, that shouldn't be so much of a challenge. But that was a big concern in the Pearl District neighborhood. Parking was an issue I kind of mentioned that people have brought up a little bit. I'd say one of the other things that I don't know if we've heard as much about tonight, but just kind of just the design, and maybe just what I mean by that is the compatibility of new housing in existing neighborhoods. And I think everybody would kind of agree that's an important factor of this. So the zoning code currently restricts things like height. It currently restricts your setbacks and your overall scale and size of a structure. So I think a lot of those things are in place to address some of those concerns. Am I missing anything else, Nathan, as far as concerns we've kind of heard from the other groups?
No, I don't think so. I mean, overall, I felt like there was more receptiveness to some of the typologies we shared from this group than others. But in reality, I think we hit on the same ones. The design and the compatibility has been a pretty big topic in all the neighborhoods. I think that's pretty common as folks start to think about the idea of a new use. They want to make sure that it's going to fit in and look okay, and it's not going to be something that's super out of character and changes kind of that dynamic of your neighborhood. To Matt's question about extending the overlay into Maple Ridge, Riverside, and some of the other neighborhoods to create diversity, there hasn't been talk initially about that, and that's really just because we're looking primarily at the areas that were covered by that housing study and where we received these recommendations and have kind of done that diligence already. And due to their adjacency to downtown. And then like Travis had mentioned, some of the more services like transit and things like that, this has become a better way to really start piloting the idea of an overlay. And the good thing about an overlay is that once it is adopted or in place, it can be taken and placed other places later. So if it works and it's something that we want to continue, we do have that option.
As far as I keep forgetting to push that button. As far as a mixed income zoning overlay, I'll be honest, I don't know exactly what that means or how that would be different from kind of what we're talking about, which is intended to open the opportunity for diverse housing options. One of the benefits being to address a variety of income levels. So I think we're tackling that in a lot of ways by introducing things other than a detached home, duplexes, multi-unit homes, cottage house developments, all those types of options are really intended to answer that kind of mixed income scenario. I think Tom had even mentioned earlier something about that. And Crosbie Heights specifically, I think there's lots of open lots and availability for things like infill and adding new housing into the mix. And really, as of right now, we haven't contemplated, ways to necessarily restrict what types of uses would have to go on specific lots to make sure there wasn't a concentration of any one specific type of use. It would kind of be open to the potential of all of those options that Nathan mentioned that we've kind of presented tonight. So I think that really overlay will help to address a lot of those mixed income and diverse housing options in general.
So Travis, I just add that I'm not sure. So definitely we've talked about what this overlay would do. Some zoning codes in other places of the country do have, they tie income requirements to different housing types through zoning, and that does require a lot of monitoring over time and things like that. So that is something that's used elsewhere. That's not something that we are really set up to do here at this point in time. But to me, this is a way of getting there, just in a different way. It's just not tied to specific incomes that can occupy those units.
Gotcha.
Larry, to your question, we don't regulate anything in the right of way through the zoning code. The zoning code's applicable really to just a private property development. So I think in regards to looking at ways to improvements to like an underpass or something like that, it really is on the streets and stormwater guys as well as ODOT, depending on where that underpass is located. So we could certainly, if you want to send one of us an email and just kind of give us what you guys are trying to do, we could at least try to help you get in contact with the right person and provide you with that resource. But the overlay is really not going to assist much in that regard.
Yeah, and thanks for the comments just from the group as far as the presentation and, interest and support of, some of the concepts that we've been talking with you about tonight. Again, I think we've got our contact slide up there, so we'll hang around for a few minutes if anyone wants to stick around and ask any other questions. Otherwise, I think people are free to go. We appreciate you being here. Looks like there's a Crosbie Heights Neighborhood Association meeting this Thursday at 6 p.m. So I'll put a plug in for Sarah on that. Be great to hear from you all. Please reach out to us, either myself, Nathan, Susan. I think we also have Amy on there. If you have any other questions or thoughts as we continue to develop this and work with both Councilor McKee and Councilor Hall Harper, that touches a lot of the areas that they represent. So thanks for being here and have a good night.